There are many habits that have been touted for years as being frugal, but in practice, they really aren't. And I think that these habits fall into three common categories. Traps that people fall into convincing themselves it's saving them money, but it's really doing them the opposite. First, I want to cover neglect traps. A neglect trap is when you avoid a higher upfront cost or decision, and that avoidance ends up leading to bigger costs later. So habit number one in neglect traps is buying budget items. This one has a lot of gray space, which is why I think it easily becomes a frugal habit that actually is making you broke. So let's unpack it. There is something called the boots theory. That comes from, of all places, a series of fantasy novels. Author Terry Pratchett writes the Discord series, which on the surface is about magic and dragons and made-up cities, but underneath he writes satire about real-world systems like class, economics, and politics. In the book Men-at-Arms, the character Samuel Vimes is a working-class guard who talks about how a good pair of boots costs $50, but an affordable pair that's sort of okay costs $10. The problem, he laments, is that the affordable ones are only good for a season or two, while the $50 ones will last you a decade or more. So you buy the affordable ones, and after 10 years, you've maybe had to buy 7 pairs of them because they keep wearing out, costing you $70 over a decade, while the $50 ones are still good, and you've only spent $50. This boots theory has become well known because it does a really good job showing that frugality, based only on upfront price, can trap people into a sort of cycle of higher long-term costs. It is easy to fall into the trap of focusing just on immediate savings. We default to saving money now because to our brain, a smaller benefit today feels more real and less risky than a larger benefit spread out over time. Future savings are essentially harder to picture. And something else it doesn't touch on is how when you buy one pair of boots once versus 7 pairs of boots over time, the extra clutter that you have to deal with now, as well as the additional cognitive load and sometimes additional costs of having to store and manage and remove your now 7 pairs of boots. And another really interesting thing about always opting cheaper is how we can get duped into thinking it's a better deal. I recently read a really interesting article where a consumer behavior specialist warned against comparing reviews of affordable items to their more expensive counterparts. In the article, she discussed how reviews get skewed based on how much someone has spent on it. So say there's a saute pan that was $30 and then one that's $150. The $30 one might have 4.7 stars and the $150 one has, 4.3. Our quick analysis would tell us that the $30 one is a deal and it's better quality because the reviews are better.
A bargain is a bargain.
But the specialists explain that people who spend more are more critical of their purchases and thus they tend to review them more strongly. Versus if you spent less, you're more likely to be liberal with your review and be like, it was pretty good for what I had to spend on it. Sure, sometimes we all find affordable steals that absolutely do the job and they last for years. I'm not trying to discount that, but in many cases, the cheaper items often fail faster, perform worse, and thus end up needing to be replaced more often. And in the long haul, this costs us more money and more work. So truly being frugal isn't just about paying the least, it's about paying the least over time. The next neglect trap is renting a storage unit. If you are someone who holds on to every sort of useful thing, it is really easy to see the allure of renting storage space. Eventually your home is not going to have room for all of this stuff, and so renting a storage space feels frugal because you can hold on to things that you have spent money on and still feel useful. Getting rid of them would be wasteful, it'd be spendthrift. There's this sort of frugal way of thinking that throwing something away is wasting money. You're losing value that you originally paid for it. And if you end up needing it later, you're gonna have to buy it again. So keeping these useful things saves you money. Storing it feels responsible. You tell yourself you might need it, you might use it, or you might eventually sell it, and that makes the monthly cost of a storage unit feel justified. But in reality, the value of the item you're storing is already gone, right? Like the money was spent when you bought the item, and paying to store it doesn't bring the money back. In this case, it just adds a new expense, and worse yet, an ongoing expense that you're going to be shelling out every month. And months turn into years, and you end up spending hundreds or even thousands of dollars storing things that you wouldn't probably buy again, and you're probably not even going to remember if you ever need them. And this one ties in really nicely to my next neglect trap, which is holding on to things because you are going to sell them later. This is a frugal habit because we think we're going to make an income from our unused stuff. It helps us justify the purchase of the thing that we didn't end up using. And usually it kind of softens the guilt of getting rid of it, like getting rid of something you paid for because you're making money back. We want to believe that we'll get the money back, but the truth is that most items depreciate in value really quickly. There's also this really interesting psychological piece that comes into play here called the endowment effect. People tend to overvalue things simply because we own them. So we price things higher than buyers are usually willing to pay for them, and honestly, more than we would be willing to pay for them. We do this for a couple of reasons. One is loss aversion. Typically, the pain of losing an item is psychologically about 2 times as powerful as the pleasure of gaining it. So that makes the value of it higher. Next, when you possess something, it creates a sense of ownership. It sort of becomes part of like our self-identity, and that makes it harder for us to part with it. There's also something really interesting called the IKEA effect. This shows that people value items more if they have invested effort into them, such as putting together furniture, why we call it the IKEA effect. So you might value that Billy bookcase higher simply because you put the effort into making it, because of your perceived ownership of it. But other people don't value them quite as high. Meanwhile, all these items are just taking up space, adding mental clutter to your life, and almost never really turning into cash. This idea goes for the same for like items we keep just in case because we say we're going to upcycle them later. Again, it mostly just leads to clutter creep. Unless you have a specific or immediate use for it, you're going to upcycle it right now. You are paying for it with your living space and your mental energy, or possibly storing it in a storage unit. And I actually talked about this idea pretty heavily in a recent video about how your home should not be a storage unit, and I'll link that one down below. We are going to move on to waste traps. Now, a waste trap is when something looks like you're being careful or like resourceful with your money, but it actually leads to overconsumption or just like unused value. So the first one I want to talk about is thrifting. Now, again, like so many of these habits you're going to see, there's a lot of gray matter here. So let's unpack this one. Yes, thrifting can be great. So great. Like I love the idea of buying used, decreasing the stuff footprint out there, right? Giving something a second use instead of it ending up in the never-ending piles of waste that we have. That being said, we are in a little bit of a thrift boom. There has been a rapid growth of secondhand shopping in recent years, driven by a mix of things, right? There's been rising costs of living. Inflation have pushed more and more people to look for affordable alternatives. And then you have online platforms making buying secondhand easier and more accessible than ever. And at the same time, sustainability messaging and like sort of backlash against fast fashion has made many of us turn to thrifting as sort of an environmentally responsible choice. The global second apparel market, for example, is growing faster than traditional retail right now, often being cited as growing as much as 2 to 3 times faster. And I love this. I love that people are trying not just to make financially smart choices, but also environmentally smart ones. But this shift also creates sort of a contradiction. Thrifting, which started as a kind of like necessity driven as a way to save money, is increasingly becoming a form of recreational shopping. And as a result, many people end up buying more simply because the items are cheaper, which undermines the original goal of spending less. And going back to the point that cheaper doesn't always mean cheaper in the long term, if you are thrifting for something you legitimately need, that's one thing. But thrifting something just because it's cheaper, like in my earlier example, always buying the cheaper option isn't always the best for our wallet. So when it comes to thrifting, we have to think about, is this just making me buy more because it's cheap? Are these things that I really need? And is the price really that much better? Our third habit in the last 4 neglect trap is DIYing. Opting to do things yourself can definitely save money, right? Sometimes it is not worth spending the money on something you can easily take care of yourself. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more when we talk about convenience creep. But you have to be mindful of this because also when it comes to DIYing things, it can shift the cost instead of reducing it. Like you might not be paying as much up front, but you got to pay for the tools and the supplies and the trial and error, and that can add up quickly. And when it comes to DIYing things that you're going to make from scratch, like making your own soaps to save money or choosing to like bulk make food, there's a higher chance of waste because ingredients expire, batches don't get used up all of the way. For example, I love to make my own almond milk, but it doesn't always make sense because homemade almond milk needs to be drank in like a week. I think you get like 5 days in the fridge. Well, store-bought is going to last me longer. And sure, my homemade almond milk tastes better. I know it's just almonds and water, but it's not always the most cost-effective option. Another personal example is canning. I had always wanted to learn how to can. I loved the idea of being able to like preserve produce before it went bad. It seemed like a great way to avoid food waste and save money. So I went out, I got all the items necessary. I spent hours learning the proper way to can different things. And then I just ended up canning a couple of things before I realized it was not something I was going to stick with. I was too worried about like storing it all, if I was doing it properly, about food poisoning. And I realized I didn't really have that much bulk food that like justified canning regularly. And while I learned how to do it, and that's really cool, now I know how, I dropped it as a normal practice in my kitchen because what seemed as like something that was going to be like the ultimate frugal habit, and it ended up just costing me more than I actually saved. And again, there's this really fine line here because there are some things that DIYing, like I swear by it, will save you money. I bulk make a ton of my own dry mixes, like pancake mix. I make my own bouillon, and I make my own multi-purpose cleaner. And these things save me a ton of money, and I use them all up, and there's never any waste. So this one really is kind of trial and error over time. But I love this quote that I found when I was reading about DIYing your own stuff on Reddit. This user said, if you're an arts and crafts person, seeing something you want and thinking, I can just make it myself and it'll cost me a lot less, this is the devil whispering lies directly into the tender ear of your hubris. If you don't already have nearly all the necessary supplies on hand, it will cost you more to make it yourself. And I really liked this idea because it is easy for us to think that we can just make it ourselves and it will be cheaper, but sometimes it isn't. And sometimes it's just the joy of making it, and that's what you're paying for, and that's fine. But if you think that making it every time is going to be cheaper, it's maybe time to reevaluate because it's not true in every circumstance. The next waste trap is couponing and just like chasing sales in general. Obviously, very easy to see how this is frugal. There is a psychological reward in like stacking discounts and finding deals and walking away feeling like you won. You have apps and coupons and limited time sales, and it kind of turns spending into a game. And on the surface, this looks like you are being smart with your money, you're saving, but there are some hidden costs that we need to consider with this one. One is the time, right? And the other is the idea of buying something that you didn't really need because you were getting a deal. So one, couponing can be a huge time suck. Searching, planning, driving to multiple locations, you're spending time and money on gas. And when you step back and do the math, sometimes the returns are pretty low. If you're saving $30, but you spent 3 hours doing it, you're working for a couple of dollars an hour. Deal chasing can also make us shift our focus from buying what you actually need to simply just like trying not to miss a good price. And we end up with clothes we got on sale, but we didn't really love them, or random home decor items that don't hold up well. And so over time, a lot of these justified purchases just pile up into like unused stuff and clutter, which, as we have discussed, carries its own mental and physical cost. Okay, finally, we are going to move on to lifestyle traps. Lifestyle traps are moving away from being less about behaviors and more about how you live and what you consider normal. And so my first habit here is assuming convenience. Now, when I say assuming convenience, I'm talking about some of the everyday conveniences that we use in our lives that we have just gotten used to, that we consider them assumed without ever really stopping to think if they are necessary. So they include things like paying for lawn care, food delivery, curbside or online ordering, takeout, streaming services, and a lot more. Assumed conveniences feel frugal because it is often framed as saving time, and our time is valuable. It feels efficient to outsource tasks, to skip steps, or to pay someone for something that's going to make your life easier, especially if you're feeling overwhelmed or busy. There's this sort of underlying belief that if you're being smart by optimizing your time, even if it costs a little more money, that it's worth it. And to be fair, if I spend $10 to save an hour, it's probably smart, right? Because if you reverse that and say you spent an hour to save $10, it means you only think your time is worth $10 an hour, which means you're paying yourself below the average minimum wage. In behavioral economics, there's something called default bias, which means once something becomes standard in your routine, you kind of stop questioning whether it's actually worth it. Many assumed conveniences fit into this default bias really well, which is what makes them so tricky. Convenience is really hard to resist because of something else called present bias. So many biases. As humans, we typically value immediate comfort over future benefits. So the convenience of something right now, like saving 20 minutes or reducing stress, feels like a better deal than the sort of like abstract idea of having to spend more money over time. Anything that removes friction feels like a relief, and that relief has a psychological value, which makes the cost way easier for us to justify in the moment. And because once you start using a convenience regularly, it becomes your baseline. What once felt like a luxury starts to feel like a necessity. And that, again, is where that default bias comes in. I'm sure we can all relate to this. Things that maybe like when we were young and in college felt like it would be a really amazing luxury, like maybe having a newer car, or I remember for me, like having a house that had its own washer dryer felt like such a luxury. But now, later in your life, when you have it, you take it for granted because it has become your default. And I've also talked in the past on how some assumed conveniences don't just cost more, but they also rob us of our own agency when we pay to outsource things that we can do for ourselves, or when doing it ourselves would give us a stronger sense of pride or enjoyment. Now, I understand the idea of assumed conveniences like makes sense, but the overall idea might be kind of abstract. I'm going to give you 3 examples of assumed conveniences that I got rid of in the last year. The first one is Kindle Unlimited. It was really easy to justify a small monthly cost to have unlimited access to basically every book. But I swapped it for just using the library, which is free, and I still have books to read every day. Number 2 is music streaming. Again, it was easy to justify a small monthly cost to have access to every song. If I was going to buy every song or album that I had listened to on music streaming, it would cost me thousands of dollars a year. But when you think about it, having access to every song is an assumed convenience. I don't really need to listen to thousands and thousands of different songs. Before streaming, most of us had a personal library and we listened to, yes, less music, but usually we would listen with more depth and we would have stronger attachment to the music that we listened to. It had become an assumed convenience that I needed to have access to every kind of song. The last assumed convenience is grocery delivery. I was so guilty of this. I had small kids, I work a full-time job, and it was really easy for me to justify saving an hour or more of my life to get my groceries delivered. But groceries are already so expensive, and I just stopped being able to justify the extra $10 for delivery. And then I thought about it that like on top of that, then there was another $10 to $15 for the tip. Giving up just those 3 things saved me about $1,500 a year, and that was just 3 of the assumed conveniences. The next habit is the idea of buying now but paying later. So buy now, pay later, and debt in general. We can often think of this as a smart way to manage our money because it kind of spreads out the cost of the purchases, like you're pacing out the spending instead of overspending at once, or it gives you the flexibility to make a bigger sort of necessary purchase. And the idea gets reinforced by common advice that says not all debt is bad. But that logic often gets stretched far beyond where it like really applies, and it can be very misleading because, I mean, at the end of the day, debt is debt. When we talk about buy now, pay later services in particular, the danger is how easily they remove any friction from spending in a place where spending is already pretty frictionless. You usually already pay online with a card, right? So that's really easy. You can do it in 1 or 2 clicks. There's not a lot of pause to make you consider the purchase. Now add in that there's no large upfront cost, no immediate interest, and the approval process is instant. It is so easy to use buy now, pay later on so many things, and one plan can turn into several, and suddenly a whole portion of your income is already committed before the money even has hit your bank account. Now, buy now, pay later companies like Klarna or Afterpay often report very low delinquency rates, usually under 1%. But the truth is that 40% of buy now, pay later people have been late making payments. This is up from 34% only 2 years ago. So this is showing a growing problem. The deeper issue is that debt, whether buy now, pay later, or just credit cards, they change your relationship with money. It makes expensive things feel accessible up front, but over time, it reduces your financial flexibility. They are very easy to misuse, and the downsides of them are built in because that is how these companies make money, right? They make money when you carry a balance or you pay late. Tools like credit cards, yes, of course they could be useful, but if they are treated as like short-term cash management tools. But the problem is that very easily they can become a habit and turn into a long-term borrowing to support a lifestyle.
I don't know who you are or what you want, but let me give you my credit card number.
The next habit that feels frugal but isn't is something called paying yourself last. What paying yourself last means is that you cover all of your expenses first, right? Your housing, your bills, subscriptions, discretionary spending, and then whatever is left goes to your savings. So you get it? It's like you're paying yourself last. On the outside, this looks smart, right? You're taking care of your expenses first. That's responsible. But what usually happens is you never actually end up saving anything. When all of your money flows outward first to groceries, rent, shopping, by the time you reach the end of the month, rarely anything like helpful or meaningful is left because all of the other expenses had a sense of consequence or urgency. Like if you miss a payment, there's going to be a penalty. If you need something new because of X, Y, and Z, there's urgency. Or maybe that thing that you really needed is on sale this month. Saving, on the other hand, it doesn't have an immediate penalty. There's no urgency. And so it constantly gets pushed to the back burner. Telling yourself you'll save it for the end of the month almost never amounts to anything. And so paying yourself first kind of flips the structure. Instead of waiting to see what remains, you decide upfront that a portion of your income, say 10 or 15%, is allocated towards savings the moment it arrives. That money is no longer available for spending, just like your rent isn't. What's left becomes your new budget. Now, once it's implemented, most people tend to describe pay yourself first as the shift that finally made saving consistent for them instead of optional. Most people who stick with paying themselves first says it removes a lot of the mental friction because the decision is already made, and over time, they naturally adjust their spending to fit what remains. Of course, at the beginning, most people often feel like their spending has suddenly shrunk. Even if it's only 10 to 15%, that can be really noticeable. Say you brought in $3,000 a month and you're paying yourself first 15%, that's $450 every month. You're gonna notice that absence. And there is usually this very common reaction at first of, I didn't realize how tight things were until I did this. Because if you're not paying yourself first, your spending doesn't really have a clear boundary. Money is flowing out on things like subscriptions and eating and convenience purchases. There's not as forced of a constraint. But when you pay yourself first, it creates a sort of limit. Suddenly, instead of having your full paycheck available, you're working with a little less, which makes all of your expenses a little more obvious. Things that felt manageable before now feel a little tighter, not because they've changed, but because you're finally seeing the total load that all of those little purchases were putting on your income. There's also behavioral lag that's going to happen when you do this. Your lifestyle doesn't instantly adjust. Spending habits and other small spending items that you had gotten used to, you're going to have to adjust to that. For a month or two, most people say the first month or two that they do paying themselves first, it feels a little tight. But it also gives you a lot of insight to your spending. Not having an extra 10 to 15% forces you to really consider the things that you were spending on before, and I think it offers a lot of clarity. Usually around month 3 or 4, things start to shift. Spending becomes more intentional, your expenses naturally adjust, and that lower available amount starts to feel like your new normal. And as your savings grow, you start to feel more in control, less worried about unexpected expenses, and that visible progress is really motivating. What felt restrictive in the first few months starts to feel really encouraging and like progress. My next frugal habit is subscriptions. Subscriptions feel frugal because each one is framed as a small and manageable cost, but the problem is our current world has everything as a subscription. Every company from dog food to coffee to music to movies to education is a subscription. And it is not because it's great for us as consumers, it's because businesses do it because it benefits them. The pricing is intentionally broken down into monthly amounts, which makes it way easier for us to justify and less obvious to think about having to cancel. On top of that, billing is automated, right? Once you sign up, there is no ongoing decisions. We sign up in the moment because it seems like the smart choice, and then we forget to check in on it a couple months later to ask ourselves if it's still actually really worth it. At the start of 2026, my husband and I tried to rid our life of every subscription, and obviously we still have some. We weren't able to get rid of all of them. We still have newspaper delivery, the online storage I use for my business, the meal plan for my son to get hot lunches at school. But I would say we cut 80 to 90% of our subscriptions, probably on the higher end. And removing them was eye-opening and so humbling. Most people, I don't think, realize how many little monthly charges are hitting their accounts. Everything from TV, music streaming, workout and fitness apps, entertainment apps, online tools, software, auto-shipped goods. I mean, the list can go on and on. Individually, none of them seem expensive. We convince ourselves that they are convenient, but but collectively they really add up, especially when you include services you realize you weren't really using or weren't actually saving you money. Another hidden issue with subscriptions is how muddy they make our finances. All of these little charges coming out at different times in different amounts makes it really hard for us to see the big picture of our budget. And when you're budgeting, clarity is clear. Knowing exactly what you have is key. All these little charges hitting our account makes it a lot harder to manage it. Subscriptions aren't necessarily expensive individually, but they are expensive collectively, both literally and mentally. All right, my friends, that does it. Some habits that maybe we have considered for a long time to be frugal habits or habits that were the smart financial choice, but in practice aren't always the right one. As with all things, some things work for some people, they don't work for other people. Some people have different ways of managing their money. I mean, there's so many factors that go into this, but I think even if you just consider a few of these and see if there's little changes that maybe things you thought that you were doing that were the smart choice, the financially responsible choice, but when you really think about it, you're like, is this really saving me the money that I thought that it was? As always, thank you so much for stopping by and watching. I hope you're having a fantastic day. Remember to be kind to yourself and others, and I will see you all in my next video.